Hi guys, Tiffany here with a cosplay tutorial over how I made the decorative corset bow for my Spirit Blossom Ahri cosplay from League of Legends. And if you'd like to use the blueprint that I'm going to use for this tutorial, it is available on my website www.tiffanygordoncosplay.com or see the link below. And here are some of the reference images for the bow. I mainly use the smaller art version as my reference. And to start off, we're going to first talk about how I made the blue part of the bow. Using the bow part of the blueprint, I pinned it to my fabric and cut out using scissors, leaving about 1 centimeter of space around the whole piece. And the fabric that we're using is some that I designed for specifically Spirit Blossom Ahri, and if you'd like to use this fabric too, you can get them on my fabric store, see the link below. Highly recommend if you use this fabric to get it in the satin material. Next, I pinned my 2 pieces of fabric together and sewed it with a single stitch, leaving the middle space open so we can put material in later. And then went back and sewed all of the edges. Next, I flipped the piece inside out and then grabbed some Quilter's fusible batting. This is going to be used throughout all of the pieces that we're sewing today. It's going to give dimension to each piece. I then traced my bow pattern onto 2 layers worth of the fusible batting and then cut out the pieces. Next, I inserted the fusible batting inside the bow piece and then sewed it together, closing the open end of the bow. Now that they're sewn, I pinned both pieces of the bow together and then sewed it together to make one bow. Now let's talk about how to make the purple parts with the gold stripe. Using my pattern, I pinned it to my fabric and then cut out, leaving 1 centimeter around all of the pieces using a rotary tool. For all of the gold stripes on these purple bows, I ended up using a craft ribbon, which I then cut to the length of the ribbon and pinned in place. And then sewed each side of the ribbon down using a zigzag stitch. Once all of the gold ribbons were sewn to the purple pieces, I trimmed off the extra pieces and then pinned the 2 halves together, trying to make sure the gold stripes aligned as much as possible. And then sewed it together using a single stitch, again leaving the bottom half open, and then going back and sewing all the edges. And when all 4 of the purple bow parts were sewn, I flipped each one inside out, and then using my blueprint, traced each piece onto the fusible batting, only 1 thickness this time, and then cut out with scissors. And then inserted the batting inside of the purple pieces, sewing it shut with a single stitch, and then doing the edge stitching. Now to talk about the pink flower part of the bow. Using my blueprint as a guide, I traced my pattern onto pink fabric, leaving about 1 centimeter around all of the pieces, which I then cut out using a rotary tool, and then pinned the 2 pieces of fabric together and sewed with a single stitch using my blueprint as a guide, and this time sewing it fully shut. Next, I trimmed off all of my extra fabric using scissors, and then went around all of the edges with fray check to help make sure all of the fibers didn't come apart. To flip this piece inside out, I first pulled the 2 pieces apart so that way I could snip one side of the fabric in the very center, and then slowly pulled all of the flower pieces inside out. This took a very long time, and I had to end up kind of squishing the edges so that way they would come out at a point. Once the piece was flipped inside out, I then used an iron on the satin fabric setting to iron it flat, and then used a zigzag stitch down the center to sew the whole together. Now to talk about how I made the pink chain ribbon-like piece. For this piece, I used a pink ribbon that I cut into 3 equal length pieces, tied into a knot, and taped to a table, and then braided these 3 strands together to make one. When the braid was done, I finished with a knot and then glued each of the ends closed with a mixture of fray check and Sobo glue. And using my blueprint as a guide, I slowly formed this chain into one of the circle shapes and hand stitched it together using a needle and thread. I repeated this process for the second and the third circle parts. until the piece looked like a pretzel-like shape. For the pieces that were left over after making this pretzel-like shape, I used that as the two little dangly parts of the ribbon. Now that all of our pieces are done, it's time to assemble them. Using my blueprint as a reference, I first start off by attaching each of the purple pieces to the corset, pinning and sewing them down. I repeated this process until all 4 parts of the purple ribbons were sewn to the corset. To attach the pink pretzel-like shape to the blue bow, I first pinned it in place and then hand stitched it with a needle and thread together. To make sure all of the pieces stayed in the circle-like shape, I did tiny little tacks of hand stitching from the pink chain to the top part of the blue bow fabric. And for attaching the flower to the pieces, I repeated the same process of pinning and hand stitching together. Next was to attach the 2 little tail pieces of the pink chain, which I did also by hand stitching. And for attaching the blue bow part to the corset, I pinned it in place and did little tack stitches so that way they would only go through the bottom part of the blue bow and not show through the top half. And for the final piece, the golden bell in the very center, I hand stitched with another needle and thread going through all of the layers so that way it would fully attach and hold in place. And that is how I created my decorative corset bow for my Spirit Blossom Ahri cosplay from the game League of Legends. Thank you guys so much for watching this little tutorial, and if you found it helpful, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you think.